They laughed at my truck. Right there in front of me, my own children pointing, snickering, taking pictures of the rusted old pickup I'd driven for decades. "Why don't you get a real car, Dad?" my son jeered, and my daughter couldn't stop giggling. I said nothing, just nodded and walked away, pretending it didn't hurt. But inside, something snapped. Every mocking word, every cruel laugh was a spark. Little did they know, that rusted truck was more than metal and dents. It was the mask of patience, the cover for a plan that would put me in the driver's seat of their fate. I parked my truck at the curb, engine rattling, the smell of oil and rust clinging to the cab. I could hear their laughter before I even saw them. My children pulled up in a convoy of shining, brand-new luxury cars, tires squealing as if announcing their superiority. My grandson hopped out, camera in hand, snapping pictures of my old pickup. "Dad, seriously? That thing still runs?" my son sneered, leaning against his polished hood like it was a throne. "I can't believe you drive this. It's embarrassing." I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I kept my voice low, almost a whisper. "It gets me where I need to go," I said, forcing a smile I didn't feel. My daughter stepped closer, her heels clicking against the pavement, pointing at the faded paint. "You should retire it, Dad. Even the neighbors are laughing behind your back." I could hear the whispers of onlookers, the distant honks, the subtle snickers. Every mocking word landed like a blow. My heart pounded, not out of fear, but something darker, a simmering, quiet fury. I remembered the nights I worked 2 jobs, the sacrifices I made, the coins I saved while they were learning to flash their first credit cards. They thought I was powerless, that my truck, my age, my modesty made me weak. But as I walked past their polished machines, I caught myself smiling. They had no idea. The wheel was still in my hands, and I'd been driving a plan they'd never see coming. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something. If your own family mocked you, laughed at your hard work, and treated you like you didn't matter, what would you do? Tell me in the comments, because I promise you're not alone. And if you think they deserve a lesson they'll never forget, hit that like button. It tells me I'm not the only one who believes in standing up, quietly but smartly. And don't forget to subscribe, because I've got more stories that'll make you question who really holds the power. I remember the first time I bought that old truck. It wasn't much to look at. Faded green paint, a dented fender, and a smell that made people wrinkle their noses. But it was mine. I'd saved every penny from long days and longer nights, working 2 jobs to make sure my family had what they needed. I didn't do it for applause. I did it because I believed that hard work, patience, and responsibility were worth more than flashy appearances. My children? Well, they grew up thinking the world revolved around credit cards, brand names, and Instagram posts. When my son was 12, I remember watching him trade his worn-out sneakers for a pair that cost more than a week of groceries. I didn't scold him. I just saved more quietly, knowing the lessons I'd teach in time would be worth far more than a flashy pair of shoes. My daughter, on the other hand, always had an eye for luxury. Birthday parties were never about family. They were about who had the bigger cake, the louder music, the fancier decorations. I smiled through it, thinking someday they'd understand. I built my life on small victories. The smell of motor oil in the garage, the metallic tang of coins stacked in jars, the rhythmic thump of my worn boots against the pavement as I walked home from yet another shift. All of it became a language of discipline and foresight. While the neighborhood kids boasted about new toys and gadgets, I quietly researched stocks, invested in small businesses, and learned the art of patience. Every rusted nail, every dented board in my old truck was a reminder of a life lived with intention, a life that would one day pay off in ways my children couldn't imagine. But as the years passed, I noticed the shift. They stopped noticing my work, my sacrifices, the late nights I spent making sure their meals were on the table, that their homework was done, that they had opportunities I never had. Instead, They started noticing appearances, my faded jacket, the rusted truck in the driveway, my quiet demeanor. I became a relic in their eyes, a relic they could mock without consequence. I remember the first real sting, the day my daughter threw a birthday party for her friends and didn't invite me. I'd spent weeks baking the cake, wrapping the gifts, saving my own money to contribute, and she didn't even look at me. I stood outside the house, watching the laughter through the window, the sound cutting deeper than any insult. I didn't go in. I didn't yell. I just walked back to my truck and drove home, my hands gripping the worn steering wheel, thinking, they'll learn. They'll learn eventually. Then came the cars. My children had started driving luxury vehicles, flashy, expensive machines that they flaunted everywhere. I had my old truck, my faithful companion, the engine rattling, the paint peeling, but it never let me down. They mocked it openly, friends laughed, neighbors whispered, strangers sneered. Every word stung, but I reminded myself, appearances can be deceiving. That truck was more than metal. It was patience, endurance, and a disguise for the life I was quietly building. The real irony? While they were focused on showing off their wealth, they ignored the signs. They didn't notice me quietly attending board meetings, reading financial reports late into the night, investing every spare dollar in opportunities that others dismissed. They thought I was too old, too slow, too modest to matter in the world of money. They laughed at the rust, the dents, the smell of gasoline, but they didn't know that every mocking glance, every snide comment, every sneer was being recorded in the ledger of my mind, a ledger I would one day balance. Even friends and neighbors would ask, "Why don't you just upgrade, buy something nice?" I'd smile, shake my head, and say, "I have everything I need." They didn't understand. They couldn't understand, because what they saw as weakness was actually my greatest strength. My invisibility, my patience, my ability to plan decades ahead while everyone else was chasing instant gratification. I think back to the moments when I could have confronted them, yelled, demanded respect, or shown them the consequences of their arrogance, but I didn't. I waited. I watched. I invested. I let them believe they were superior, that my truck, my modesty, my quiet life were signs of failure. I let them underestimate me, and that underestimation became the weapon I carried in plain sight. Looking back now, I can see the pattern clearly. Every insult, every mockery, every laugh was not just a wound. It was a breadcrumb, leading to the moment when I would no longer be invisible. Every time my children flaunted their wealth, I was building mine. Every time they sneered at my old truck, I was preparing the instrument of their reckoning. And as I watched them line up their cars, showing off in front of friends and neighbors, I realized something. The very thing they mocked, the rusted, rattling old truck, was the thing that would drive the final chapter of this story. They thought they were in control. They had no idea. The wheel had always been in my hands. It wasn't just the laughter that hurt, it was the way they flaunted everything they had, as if my sacrifices were invisible. My son drove past my truck every morning, revving his engine like a trophy, windows down, music blaring, showing off a car I could have bought 10 times over if I had wanted to waste money like that. My daughter paraded her friends around the driveway, pointing at the dents and peeling paint, each word a jab straight to the pride I'd held on to for decades. And yet, I said nothing. I smiled quietly and nodded. That silence, that was my armor. But life, as it often does, escalates. The first real complication came one chilly autumn evening. I had parked my truck outside the bank where I'd been quietly building investments, my laptop in the passenger seat, papers scattered from a long day of reviewing market trends. My son drove past in his convertible, leaned out the window, and shouted, "Hey, Grandpa, why don't you upgrade that antique? Or are you planning to trade it in for a horse next? He laughed so hard he nearly lost control of the wheel. My daughter honked, waving at a group of friends, their laughter like a chorus of mockery echoing in my ears. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the faded dashboard of my truck, the metallic scent of oil heavy in the air. I thought about every investment I'd made in secrecy, every careful calculation, every stock and property I had quietly acquired while they chased fleeting trends. They didn't know that their next turn of fortune could be controlled by the man they mocked. Then came the first domino, a financial crash, one the economists had whispered about, but no one seemed to take seriously. Banks were failing, luxury assets were plummeting, and suddenly, my children's world of glittering cars and designer everything teetered on the edge. I could see the worry creeping into their eyes as they realized that their wealth, which they assumed was untouchable, was vulnerable. And they still had no idea that I was already planning my move. Adding another layer of complication, my neighbor, Mr. Hawkins, approached me one evening with news. "Did you hear about the bank auctioning off luxury cars to recover debts?" he asked, sipping his whiskey. I nodded casually, hiding the spark of excitement that rose in my chest. "Yes," I said. "Some people are going to be very surprised soon." Hawkins didn't know that I was already one of the bidders for the bank itself. He didn't know that the man driving the rusty old truck was about to control the fate of those who had laughed at him for decades. Meanwhile, my children began to show cracks in their armor. My daughter, usually so composed and self-assured, started making frantic calls to their financial advisors, panic lacing her voice. My son, always arrogant, began taking the long way home, avoiding the street where I parked my truck. They whispered to each other, confused by the sudden instability of their world. But the biggest twist? They were still unaware that the man they had ridiculed every morning, the man they assumed was weak and powerless, was quietly orchestrating the ultimate reversal. As the days passed, I introduced additional complications to my plan, securing partnerships, moving investments, and quietly acquiring shares in the bank that controlled repossessions. Every step required precision. One wrong move and my plan would unravel. But the thrill of control, the anticipation of poetic justice, made every sleepless night worthwhile. My children, still blinded by arrogance, never suspected a thing. They treated me as an afterthought, an old man who existed for nostalgia, not power. And then came the tipping point. My son called me one evening, voice sharp, exasperated. "Dad, you don't understand. The bank is threatening to take our cars if we don't cover the losses. This isn't funny." I chuckled softly, savoring the irony, and replied, "I understand perfectly." He froze on the other end of the line, confusion and fear mingling in his tone. My daughter tried to intervene, but I didn't raise my voice. I simply let the weight of my words settle, watching the panic bloom. Every betrayal they had committed, mocking my truck, belittling my efforts, ignoring the years of sacrifice, was coming full circle. And still, there was one more layer I had to navigate. Their pride. I couldn't just take their cars outright. That would be predictable. No. I needed to make them understand the full measure of their arrogance, their disregard, their cruelty. I had to be subtle, patient, and precise, ensuring that each step compounded the tension, each move heightening the inevitable shock. By the end of this phase, the stakes were higher than ever. My children were teetering on the edge, unaware that the very man they had ridiculed for decades, the one who drove a rusted, rattling truck, was about to steer their fate completely. Every laugh, every sneer, every insult had prepared me for this moment. And while the world seemed chaotic around them, in my mind, the path was clear. I was in control, and soon the tables would turn in a way they'd never forget. I spent weeks behind the wheel of that old truck, moving between meetings, scanning market reports on my laptop, and quietly making calls that no one would suspect. From the outside, I was just an old man with a rattling pickup, driving around like a relic from another time. But every tap on the keyboard, every conference call, every handshake in a dimly lit office was a step closer to turning the tables on my children. The first part of the setup was acquisition. The bank that held the power to repossess luxury cars, my children's toys in other words, was up for sale after the market crash. I had prepared for this moment for years, small investments here, quiet influence there, and suddenly when the bank went up for auction, I had the means to place the winning bid. I wasn't greedy, I wasn't reckless, I was meticulous, and I was invisible. My children never suspected that the man they mocked every morning was about to own the very institution that could destroy their sense of security. Next came patience. I knew I couldn't reveal my intentions too soon. That would spoil the surprise. They needed to believe they were still in control, that their flashy cars and status symbols were untouchable. So I played the part of the harmless old man, nodding politely at their snide remarks, smiling at their arrogance, pretending that their mockery didn't sting. Meanwhile, I quietly secured the final shares I needed, setting up financial contingencies, ensuring that when the time came, there would be no escape. I also had to consider optics. If I simply called in the repossessions, it would be too obvious. I wanted the lesson to be complete: humiliation, shock, and a clear reminder of who had underestimated whom. So I arranged everything in steps. First, minor warnings, subtle notices, small hints of instability that would unsettle them without revealing the full scope. I watched them stress over every late payment, every market fluctuation, and I allowed them to stew in their arrogance. Their anxiety was almost entertaining. Then I set the stage for the final act. The repossession notices had to arrive at the perfect moment, when they were celebrating some fleeting victory, a birthday, a promotion, anything that reinforced their sense of invincibility. That way, the shock would be amplified. Every detail was calculated: timing, delivery, escalation. I coordinated with the bank staff, keeping my identity shielded behind layers of bureaucracy. My children believed it was just bad luck, bureaucracy, maybe even karma. Little did they know it was carefully orchestrated justice. I also used my network to subtly manipulate perception. Local friends, neighbors, even distant family members were briefed, without revealing the plan, on how to respond if my children sought advice. The goal wasn't just financial loss, it was psychological impact. I wanted them to feel the sudden shift of power, the realization that they had spent years mocking someone who could quietly control their lives with a few well-timed decisions. There were moments when doubt crept in, late nights staring at spreadsheets, market forecasts, and the rusted steering wheel of my truck. But I pushed through. This wasn't just about money. This was about respect, about correcting decades of arrogance, about showing that patience, foresight, and quiet resilience could outmatch reckless pride. Every laugh they had thrown at me, every mocking comment, fueled my resolve. Every dent in my truck, every scrape of rust, reminded me that I had been underestimated, and that underestimation would be their downfall. Finally, the dominoes were aligned. The bank was ready, the notices prepared, the timing perfect. My children were blissfully unaware of the storm I had been assembling quietly for months or years. I drove my truck past their houses one evening, feeling the familiar rumble beneath me, the smell of oil and gasoline, a reminder of everything I had built. They waved, smiled, maybe even mocked. And I smiled back, not with arrogance, not with gloating, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the wheel had always been in my hands. I parked the truck outside my own home that night, watching the city lights flicker, and for a moment, I allowed myself to imagine their faces when they received the first notice. Confusion, disbelief, anger, desperation, all part of the symphony I had orchestrated. I poured a glass of whiskey and sat by the window, letting the anticipation settle in. The setup was complete. All that remained was the execution. And in that moment, I realized the beauty of the plan. I hadn't had to raise my voice. I hadn't had to argue or fight. I had simply waited, invested, and quietly maneuvered the pieces into place. My children had spent years thinking they were superior, thinking that appearances mattered more than substance. They had mocked the rusted pickup, but that truck had carried more than me. It had carried my patience, my foresight, and the promise of a reckoning they would never forget. The day finally came when the world I had quietly built collided with the arrogance of my children. It began innocuously enough. A letter slipped under my son's fancy office door, an email pinging my daughter's phone. At first, they thought it was a clerical error, maybe some mistake from the bank. But as the notices piled up, each more urgent than the last, their confusion turned into disbelief. "Dad, what's going on?" my son demanded over the phone, voice strained with panic. "They're taking the cars. This can't be happening." I leaned back in my chair, swirling the glass of whiskey in my hand, the amber liquid catching the sunlight streaming through my window. I smiled, letting the silence linger just long enough for my words to hit like a hammer. "I understand perfectly," I said. "It's just business." The irony was almost poetic. These were the same children who had mocked the rusted truck I drove every day, who had scoffed at the idea that someone like me could wield any influence. And now, here they were, begging, pleading, scrambling to salvage what they had once taken for granted. I had orchestrated everything in layers. First came the smallest, almost trivial repossessions. One sports car here, a luxury SUV there. My daughter's eyes widened as she realized her favorite vehicle had been quietly removed from her driveway overnight. My son's face paled when he received a formal notice demanding immediate repayment of loans he assumed were covered by family wealth. Their panic was subtle at first, a creeping dread, and I watched it with the calm satisfaction of someone who had waited decades for this moment. But the real fun began with the escalation. I had ensured that the notices were not just official, but humiliating. The language was formal, cold, and unyielding, as though the very bank itself was speaking with icy authority. They couldn't negotiate, they couldn't charm, and they certainly couldn't intimidate me. I was the invisible hand guiding their downfall. I watched from a distance as my children's world unraveled in slow motion. My son called his financial advisors, screaming, but no one could intervene. I had anticipated every loophole. My daughter, usually composed and commanding, sat at her dining table, hands trembling over her smartphone, refreshing the email inbox that kept filling with bad news. Friends and colleagues offered advice, but nothing could reverse the carefully plotted course of events. And then came the pièce de résistance, the moment that would leave an indelible mark. I had arranged a meeting at the very bank they had once admired, the place they had trusted blindly, the symbol of their status and success. They arrived, suits pressed, hair styled, smiles confident. And there I was, the old man in the rusted pickup, waiting in the boardroom with the final papers. Their expressions shifted from confusion to horror as the realization sank in. "Dad, you—" my daughter stammered, unable to complete the thought. My son's jaw tightened, his confidence evaporated. "I bought the bank," I said simply. "Every last share, every decision, every car you thought you owned is now under my authority. And unless you comply with the terms I set, they're gone." The room went silent. Their pride, their arrogance, their years of mockery, they had nothing left to cling to. And I had orchestrated it so that even their desperate attempts to save face only amplified their humiliation. I wasn't cruel. I was just precise. I wasn't seeking vengeance in anger. I was teaching a lesson in respect, patience, and foresight. I watched as the full weight of reality crushed them, Their luxury cars, symbols of vanity, excess, and mockery, were being reclaimed by the very man they had disrespected for decades. I could see the shock in their eyes, the realization that every laugh they had thrown at me had fueled this moment. I had waited, I had planned, and now, with meticulous timing, I held the cards. And in that room, as I signed the final documents confirming the repossessions, I noticed something remarkable. There was no anger in me, no gloating, only quiet satisfaction. The irony of their predicament, the poetic justice of their downfall, was more than enough. Every insult, every sneer, every mocking word they had ever uttered had been accounted for, and the tables had turned completely. By the end of the day, my children were reduced to pleading, negotiating, and begging, not with me, not with the bank staff, but with themselves, facing the consequences of arrogance and underestimation. I had no need to say more. The lesson had been delivered. And as I drove my rusted pickup home that evening, feeling the familiar rumble beneath me, I realized the most satisfying part of revenge isn't in the destruction. It's in the precision, the control, and the knowledge that justice was served exactly as planned. No one saw it coming. Not the neighbors, not their friends, certainly not my children. They had laughed at the truck, laughed at the old man, laughed at the patience I carried like a second skin. But now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city, I knew one thing for certain. I had driven their fate all along, and every mile of that old pickup had been worth it. By the time the sun fully set, the chaos had settled. My children sat in silence, finally understanding the weight of underestimating me. The cars were gone, the status symbols stripped, and the arrogance that had defined them for years reduced to humility. Bitter, unshakable humility. I didn't gloat. I didn't laugh. I simply walked past them in my old truck, the engine rattling like a reminder of everything they'd ignored. Each mile I drove felt like a small victory, a quiet echo of patience, foresight, and resilience. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't in shouting, fighting, or showing off. It's in waiting, planning, and moving with precision while the world believes you're powerless. And as I parked under the streetlight that night, I whispered to myself, and to anyone watching, they laughed at my old truck, but I was driving their fate all along,